Well, today we heard another part of the letter of James, which is one of the less well-known books of the New Testament, especially among Protestants. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that Jesus is actually only mentioned twice in the entire book. And secondly, this letter has an emphasis on good works, on doing what is right. And the Reformation was, in part, fought on the basis that the medieval church was placing too much emphasis on having to do certain things in order to get into heaven, like pay the church money. But I think that that really misses the point of what James is talking about here, because James isn't writing about salvation. He's writing to remind people how we should live after we say, I believe. Now, I have to say, James isn't much fun to preach on. It's way too obvious. It's full of pithy little truisms like, be swift to learn and slow to speak, which probably sounds like the advice your mother gave you. In today's passage, James says, be doers of the word, not hearers only. These days, we would probably say actions speak louder than words. And we don't need James to remind us of this. We already know it. But of course, that's the point that James is making here. We do already know it, but knowing and doing are not the same thing. We can know all the right answers and still mess up mightily. Now, we live in a culture that's really good at knowing, but James is reminding us that knowing what is right is not as important as doing what is right. After all, Jesus never asked his followers, do you agree with me? Or does this sound reasonable to you? Jesus didn't want mere agreement. What Jesus said was, follow me. In other words, do what I do. He was teaching discipleship, not intellectual agreement. He's inviting us to travel with him as fellow workers, not as tourists admiring the scenery. Now, we sometimes forget that each of the letters in the New Testament was written to address a specific congregation in a specific situation. And James seems to have been dealing with a relatively well-to-do congregation by the standards of his time and place, in which many of the more well-off members wanted to just believe. They didn't want to have to do things like help the poor, who in the Bible are usually referred to as the widows and orphans. And sadly, this is not restricted to just that particular congregation or that particular time. So far from being irrelevant, I think James is speaking to us and our context, because compared to most of the world, we are all relatively well-to-do and live a comparatively comfortable lifestyle. And the great temptation for us, both individually and as a congregation, is to forget or to ignore that our faith calls us to care for those outside our own circle of family and friends. Not just care for them in the sense of feeling badly that they're suffering, but doing whatever it is that's in our power to make life better for them. And we do need to be really intentional about this, because our culture constantly encourages us to focus on ourselves and our desires first. How many commercials are there that say, you deserve this? And that allows us to think of the problems of those in need in the abstract. It makes it easy to assume that the responsibility to care for the poor or the lonely or the unemployed belongs with the government or the social service agencies or anyone else other than me personally. Now, sadly, I think the church itself is partly responsible for allowing us to be passive rather than active in our faith. If you ask most Anglicans what they look for in a good sermon, they will usually give responses like, I like a sermon that helps me to think about things in a new way, or I like a sermon that engages my mind and helps me to reflect. Now, I'd like to think that my sermons, at least at my best, spur thinking and reflection and help you to understand things in new ways. But there's always the risk of falling into the trap that thinking faith is about sitting and listening and taking in and thinking. People will sometimes say of worship, I think of church as a filling station. I come here empty to get filled so I can make it through the week. But the problem with that image is that it's completely passive. It makes church into a place where we come, sit back and say, okay, do it to me, fill me up. But the test for good worship, the test for strong faith, is not actually what we do here during this 1 hour of worship a week. It's whether or not we then go and act as followers of Christ for the rest of the week. Maybe that's why today's text from James links our inaction to deceit. Be doers of the word, not hearers only, who deceive themselves. A link is being made here between our inaction, our inability or unwillingness to put the word into action, and dishonesty. We deceive ourselves into thinking we have faith when we've merely listened and reflected and pondered and thought, yeah, that's true. Absolutely. I totally agree with that. So it may indeed be a truism, but James is quite right to remind us that what we profess is not nearly as important as what we do. Faith is only real when it's embodied, when it's acted out. So, when you leave worship today, will you be changed by the songs and the prayers and the sermon and the fellowship that we have experienced? Will what we do this hour help mold the actions of your life in the coming week, months, years? Because James says that's the real test. Agreement and understanding are not the issue. The issue is, what will we do once we've said, sung, prayed, heard? Do you leave here willing to work at being a more caring, more generous, more active person in your faith? Or are you just going to sit back and think about how bad things are in the world? Reverend, that was a wonderful sermon, said the parishioner at the door. To which the preacher replied, that remains to be seen.